Hi everyone and welcome. This week we are talking about revision of our papers, and we're thinking specifically about how do we take a rough draft and turn it into a final draft. This can be a really difficult task for a lot of people, and I know that when I was in college it was for me as well. What typically would happen is I would take my paper to my professors, and my professors would say, "This isn't quite up to snuff, go make it better," and send me out. And I had no clue what it meant to actually revise a paper. I knew what it meant to edit a paper, so often I would go and run it through spell check, and I would do the grammar check on Microsoft Word or whatever it may be, maybe even take it to some of my friends who are better at noticing grammatical issues than I was, and then clean up the grammar. But this is a little bit like taking a car that's not working and running it through the car wash. That at the end of the day, if it's still not operating the way that you need it to, it doesn't matter how shiny it is. So I want us to, instead of sort of going out into the forest and not knowing what revision actually looks like, I want us to talk about what it actually means to revise a paper, and I want to show you why papers need revision, because I think that this whole thing can be demystified pretty easily, but it requires sort of a careful eye for how papers come to be to understand why they're going to need some revision and what that revision actually looks like. So at the end of this video, you're going to understand specifically body paragraphs. So we're not talking about the introduction. We've already had a video for that. And we're not talking about conclusions necessarily, although we may have a little bit here and there that sort of addresses conclusions. Instead, I want us to talk specifically about body paragraphs. These are quite literally the most important part of your paper, because your intro and conclusion sort of bookend the best parts of the meat of the paper. So in the same way that you order a sandwich based on what's inside of it and then the bread is secondary, think of your intro and conclusion a little bit that way, that the bread is still important but not nearly as important as what goes inside. So we have two models here, and I want us to start here on the left side of my page. So if you're looking at the same screen as me, you'll see it here on the left. And we're talking specifically about intuitive or writer-based models. Now, what a writer-based model means is this is your rough draft. This is what you write intuitively. The key with intuitive is that it's how things work just if you think about it in the obvious way that you would go about processing something. So intuitive can mean something like, for example, if you think that on a computer you can drag and drop something in the trash can and get rid of it, and you can, that's intuitive. You see a trash can, you're familiar with drag and drop, so that speaks to your intuition. However, counterintuitive would be if you have to click the button, spin around 3 times, and then hit the letter B, Y, and Z. There's nothing obvious about that. That's counterintuitive. It doesn't speak to what we're talking about. Your rough draft will often be intuitive. But because it's intuitive, it means you've written it for yourself as a writer. But ultimately with a paper, you're trying to make it into what we call a reader-based model. We're trying to think of how do we repackage what we've written for an audience to get in the order they need it, not the order we found it. Think of yourself a little bit like an attorney in this sense, that an attorney gets a big old box of evidence, and then she sorts through the evidence, figures out her argument, and then when she gets in the courtroom with that audience, the jury, the first thing she's going to do is say her argument so that the jury has it, because they need to know that first. She didn't find it first, but she offers it first, because she is going from her intuitive model to a counterintuitive model based on the reader, or the audience more specifically. Now, intuitively, I want you to see here that we have a structure. This is a structure I see in a lot of body paragraphs. We've got our evidence. We'll open the paragraph, and then often you'll put in your evidence. You'll say, you know what, I know I have this quote in my database. This is a really good one. I need it in my paper, and you'll put it in your paper, and then you'll think about it. And that thought process, that's your analysis. You're looking at it and thinking about it. What are you going to say about it? And then in the paper, you'll write your claim. This is great, you're making good progress, but I put the analysis here in parentheses because it's not in your paper yet. You haven't spelled it out to the reader, so while it's still in your brain and still important, that's not being articulated. Now, when you think about the number one anxiety students have when writing a paper, it's often page length. So the other reason this whole process is important is if you watch what we're doing here, this is actually going to increase the page length without adding fluff. Nobody adds fluff thinking it's going to make your paper better. You just think it's going to make it longer. Well, what if you could make your paper better and longer at the same time? Great. That's what we want. Now, what we have again is we have students who often open with evidence, think about it, and then write a claim. This is a natural, intuitive method for writing papers, but it doesn't get your message across to the readers in the order that they need it. Down here I've written an example. I hope you all can read it. And this is from Sonny's Blues, a story that we read in Literature 277 if you're in that group. And I want you to see here what we have is immediately evidence. So it says, the story Sonny's Blues includes a letter that says, "You don't know how much I needed to hear from you." The following paragraph goes on to say, I can't tell you much about how I got here. The final paragraph opens with the line, "I don't want you to think it had anything to do with me being a musician." And notice that this is all evidence. This is all stuff that could have come out of my database. It's all from the story directly. Then finally we have here, these lines repeat negative phrasing that shows a breakdown of communication and understanding between the brothers. They're not communicating because there's this sort of iteration of I don't know, I can't tell you. And we're seeing that, but notice the process here that we back into the claim this way. So we have our evidence right up front. We've thought about it clearly, or else we wouldn't be able to make this last statement, but we haven't said how we got there from the analysis to the claim, and the claim is at the end. Your audience, however, needs that claim right up front in the same way that a jury needs to know what a lawyer is trying to prove immediately, so they can check the evidence against the claim. And this here, I hope we have it. I'm going to slide this over just to make sure that my face isn't blocking it. This is what we're shooting for ideally, is this structure, a counterintuitive model based on what the reader needs, not the way the writer found it. We want our claim up front so the reader can know what we're trying to show. Then we want our evidence, which is great. And then after our evidence, we want our analysis. We want to break down what we've already put out there so we can pull more information from it. And this is what that paragraph would look like. The opening lines to each paragraph in the letter Sonny Blues, Sonny sends his brother in Sonny's Blues, repeat negative phrasing that shows a breakdown of communication and understanding between the brothers. That's really great because we've already guided our readers' attention to what they're looking for when we offer the evidence. That's really critical because you don't want to just give them evidence and assume that they know what you're doing with it. You want to tell them what to look for. And here we've said a repetition of negative phrasing tied to the idea of communication and understanding between brothers. So when they read this, their eyes are drawn to that. It may be obvious to you, but it's not always obvious. They may be thinking these quotes say something different, or they point to a different type of argument. We want to be really clear about what it is we're hoping to show, because we can often use the same quotes in papers on many different topics. So as obvious as you think it is, it's not. Spell it out clearly and plainly for your readers. Then we have our evidence right here. Notice the negative phrasing in each. The first opens, "You don't know how much I needed to hear from you." The following paragraph goes on to say, I can't tell you much about how I got here." The final paragraph opens with the line, "I don't want you to think it had anything to do with me being a musician." Now, everybody's read the story, so we know that this is about his addiction to drugs, so we don't have to spell that out for our readers in the same way that we don't have to summarize a movie if we're talking about our favorite movie with our friends who have already seen it. The assumption is our audience has seen it. But what we do want to do is after we've given our evidence, we're not going to leave it just there. There's still more to be done. We want to mine it for more information, and that's where the analysis comes in. Analysis is when we break down what we have, so we're looking for narrower pieces of information or detail. Two best examples you can get of this process, the claim evidence analysis, is to watch ESPN or watch the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel will make a claim. This is going to be one of the hottest summers on record. Here's our evidence for it. So they're going to say we've got this water temperature in the oceans, we've got this many days of sunshine, this many days of rain, and what this adds up to is this. So they're going to break down all of that evidence and not just give it to you, but they're going to show how it all fits together. Same holds true here. So what we've got here is, I want you to notice this line. When we look more closely at these lines, feel free to use this, especially in rough drafts. Use lines like when we look more closely, when we dig more deeply, when we break it down more, when we examine it more thoroughly. Whatever you want to say, guide your attention back to the evidence. When we look at these lines, we see not only a breakdown in communication, but also a desire to be understood and communicate more clearly. Sonny even says he needed to hear from his brother and that he worries his brother will misinterpret the role of music in addiction. So these are both pieces of evidence that when we look more closely, speak to those next layers. So be looking at that evidence. As you're revising your paper, you're going to want to use these models to try to figure out ways that you can revise your paper for clarity and specifically for flow. Flow is giving your reader evidence and information in the order they need it, and the order they need it is claim, evidence, and analysis, because when they get a claim, they need to check it against the evidence, and then they want to know what they do with it after that. If you do it this way, your reader is going to read and say, great evidence, interesting. Oh, that's a cool claim. Let me go back and check the evidence. So they're literally being sent back in your paper, and then they have to skip ahead to the next paragraph. This one, however, you make a claim. They say, that's great. I wonder if they can ground it in evidence. There's the evidence right there. And then they say, great, what do we do with it next? There's the analysis. It's the order they need it. Couple of pro tips for you as you're going through this process. When I'm helping a student to write their papers and revise their papers, the first thing I notice is the paragraph length. If your paragraphs are short, there's a very good chance you're still in this model. Very good chance. If your paragraphs are short and you open with evidence or quotes are coming very early in the paragraph, that's a really good sign to me that we're still in this level. And then after quotes, if we get to this level here and I get quotes at the end of a paragraph, but there's no analysis, no breakdown, that's also a good sign that maybe you've made your way here to the claim and evidence, but we haven't developed our analysis yet. That also happens pretty often, where I'll have a student come in and say, you know what, my paper's not doing so well, or I'm having trouble getting to page length, and I'll get this paragraph. So this paragraph will have the claim and evidence, but the analysis is missing. So the key here is to try to diagnose where you are in this process, or try to identify. Diagnose is not necessarily the right word because you're not a sick student, you're just a developing student. So you want to be thinking of where you are in this process, so identifying those steps. Again, key here, think about the claim, think about evidence, think about analysis, and remember that it's not always in order, even if you think it's in order already. This is a good check for you, and if you're doing a good job, there's a good chance through this revision process, your paper will get longer and stronger at the same time. Always a good thing for a paper, particularly when papers often bring anxiety about your page length. So just be aware of that as you go through this. Once again, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I hope this video is useful, and I look forward to talking with you. Good luck through the revision.